Greiner Talks, about sustainability and transformation. A Greiner podcast episode.
How to change, how to create a sustainable future. That's what we're discussing here. My name is Alexander. I'm part of the sustainability team at Greiner. And in this episode, we will dive into the world of biodiversity. My guest is a renowned ecologist and biodiversity researcher. He's a professor at the University of Vienna. He's a member of the Austrian Biodiversity Council, and he was awarded Austrian Scientist of the Year in 2022. Welcome, Franz Essl.
Hi, thanks a lot for the invitation, Alexander.
We are at the Climate Lab Vienna. That's quite an exciting place for anybody working in sustainability. But where can I find you actually on a regular workday?
Yeah, I'm a biodiversity researcher, and basically I'm working at the Department of Botany and Biodiversity Research. And if you have no understanding where you find this place, then it's easy if you know where the Botanical Garden in Vienna is located. And the building next to the Botanical Garden, that's the place where I'm working, together with other people, scientists, ecologists basically, working on different aspects of biodiversity research and by implication conservation.
Do you usually stay inside writing research papers, teaching students, or can I find you outside in nature as well?
When I was young, I had spent quite a lot of time, what you would call in the field, but it was really driven by strong interest before I even started to study in Vienna. So for me, the decision to study ecology was a very easy one when I had finished my school in Upper Austria. But nowadays it has changed quite a lot, I would say. As a university professor, you have to cover quite a broad range of fields, which I really like. But in the end, and that's a big pro from my perspective, I can really decide where I really want to put my focus on. And in my case, it's also communication about the biodiversity crisis.
You are mentioning the biodiversity crisis, and I'd like to start with a status update on biodiversity. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity recently concluded that every day up to 150 species go extinct. So animals like the Tasmanian tiger, the Japanese sea lion, or the golden toad, they all went extinct within the last century. What's the state of biodiversity on our planet? Are these shocking facts and figures representing the situation correctly?
You will not be surprised that I concur with this assessment. What we actually know is simply the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, the three species you mentioned are iconic species, usually mammals or vertebrates. These are species that people notice that they're declining and ultimately, in the worst case, they're going extinct. But the vast majority of species are little to even unknown species to science, insects, invertebrates in general. So the innocuous small creatures that run basically the planet of biodiversity. And that's, of course, very worrisome because biodiversity decline in such an extent is reflecting that we humans are actually overusing the planet Earth, the biophysical foundations of our society in the end, because the material goods we are eating, we are using for our daily livelihoods in general, fibers, woods, and so on. But also the services that we get from nature without recognizing them usually. Animals that are pollinating our trees or crops and many other features that we derive from an intact nature, even without noticing in a daily life, because we take them for granted, are eroding. And this is a process that cannot continue forever. And what is totally clear from a scientific point of view, it's a process that proceeds into even more dangerous, unknown and uncharted territories. Will have unknown, but in any case, severe consequences for humanity.
And how come we do not manage to put more focus on such a topic that is so important and actually crucial for our planet and for us humans?
The big issue is that there's not one lever where you can change and stop the biodiversity crisis, so to bend the curve of biodiversity loss and also climate change. First, I have to say both crises are really strongly intertwined. When you destroy biodiversity, you're also contributing to climate change in many ways, because Destruction of ecosystems like forests, for instance, means that the carbon dioxide that has been stored in trees, for instance, is released. And released means it's going into the air and contributing to climate change. So we are living on a planet where we humans have become accustomed that services from nature are basically free for everyone or have a very low cost. And because these cost factors are not factored into prices, they are inadequately accounted for in decision-making on the political level, but also on the level of individuals, and also most importantly, maybe on the decision-making of companies, for instance.
So a shift in priorities definitely needed.
The big gap is not about having the right political agreements. We have ambitious political agreements for mitigating climate change, the Paris Agreement, and similar agreements for biodiversity conservation. That's an agreement that has been signed in 2022 in Montreal with very ambitious goals. But the big issue is the lack of implementation. And the lack of implementation, the putting the policies on the ground, comes from a lack of willingness, also political willingness, to actually change in a predictable way, but with clear goals, the way we are doing our daily life, we are doing our economic decision-making, to steer us away from the destructive path we are on towards a path with a more livable and a more prosperous future. And here the lack of decision-making is most pronounced, unfortunately.
What are the 3 most important things that a country can do to protect biodiversity?
I would focus Austria. It's a bit context dependent. If you would speak about a country from the global south, maybe you have different issues. In Austria, so a prosperous country with lots of resources, I would say the main 3 issues that urgently need to be addressed is, first, we need a different kind of land use, basically agriculture. An agricultural system that produces equally food, but also provides us with intact nature, and also that contributes to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, basically. That would mean for farmers it must be also economically attractive to produce in a sustainable way. That's currently unfortunately not guaranteed. Second important point is we have a huge daily consumption of areas in Austria being built up. 11 hectares are converted into settlements or roads or other infrastructures on a daily basis. And it's clear that we cannot continue for a long time on this path. Otherwise, we would basically seal up all our fertile soils. And the final point would be we have a incomplete and inadequately implemented system of protected areas. While we have quite a number of protected areas, they are heavily biased towards, remote areas in the Alps, but where the people are living and where biodiversity conservation is equally urgent, we have little protected areas, and many of these are not implemented in a way that they are really effective. So much more money, much more resources, and much more attention must go to an effective conservation area system.
And now you are speaking on the podcast of a plastics and foam producing company. I'd like to know from you, what is the impact of a plastics producing company on biodiversity? How are these two at all connected? That seems somehow hard to grasp.
Yeah, I think this initial thought is understandable, but I would argue that every big company, and Greiner is a big company, a global player in the plastic and foam industry, so the impact goes beyond what the company is doing. First, the way you produce and how ambitious you actually implement policies, company policies, to reduce, for instance, the climate impact according to the Paris Agreement, which means basically everyone and also every company has to reduce its climate impact by at least 50% per decade. That means from 2020 to 2030, minus 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a very important point, and for such a big company, that really makes a difference. Secondly, the way you use the quite big areas where you produce is also quite relevant. If you invest into new buildings, how do you do that? do you ensure that the buildings are built in a way that they are sparsely consuming new unsealed areas? Are you ideally completely using the big roofs you have? I would like to see a solar farm on the roofs. Yeah, and that's of course also quite relevant. And then you have many products that you are actually bringing to the place and transporting them to other places. The way you use different modes of transport have quite a significant impact on climate, but also potentially on biodiversity. So you also have to think this through, how much of the products have to be actually transported on the road. I know it's maybe difficult to implement. There may be other restrictions. There may be other arguments. But you have to think this through and make decisions that actually reflect the broader impact you have on the biodiversity, climate, and society in general.
Now, setting science-based targets on climate protection, that is one thing that we have recently successfully done. And also building up solar farms on roofs is something that we are working on. But what else would you recommend to protect biodiversity or to even to nourish biodiversity? For a company like Greiner, what can we do on top of that?
I also think that such companies, big companies, they play a pivotal role also in national or international policy making. If such companies unite and express and support specific policies that are in line with what you said, Alexander, with scientific-based targets, this may nudge policies into the right direction. So if you're vocal about that, that makes a difference. And there are such alliances where leaders in specific fields actually unite to express their support and even urge, for instance, national governments to actually implement the policies they have promised to implement, but they're not implementing for conservation, for climate mitigation policies. So I would urge Greiner, if it has not made this decision yet, to actually join such leader alliances in Austria, but also beyond Austria.
Now there's lots of protests going on at the moment in Austria and beyond. There's a group called Last Generation who are actually gluing themselves to the street, trying to stop the traffic from moving, and they're creating a lot of buzz in the media and a lot of opinion. What is your take on these forms of protest?
For me, there's no doubt at all that the aims of these societal movements are fully justified. And it's even underpinned by a recent statement of all public universities in Austria. So the heads of all 21 public universities in Austria actually supported the activities of climate activists. I mean, that was quite a unique move. If you read the statements, the public statements of Guterres, the head of the UN, then it's totally clear that he's strongly supporting very ambitious and urgent climate change policies. It's fully clear that the lack of political changes in policy making on climate in Austria, but also in many other countries, that's the root cause for these protests. Would a climate policy be in place that actually pursues what has been promised, there would be no need for such protests. Still, I understand if you are waiting to get to your workplace, for instance, and you happen to get into such a form of protest, you may be annoyed. That's understandable. But to be honest, the chance to get in such a traffic jam is so minor that it's extremely, extremely unlikely. So there are many more traffic jams caused by much too much traffic on the roads. I mean, that's a main issue, of course.
And it's much more likely that we end up in a climate catastrophe.
Yeah, it's one way to actually highlight the urgency of what is needed to be done. And it's really serving the purpose. But generally speaking, I support any kinds of democratic protests that actually bring up the issue as urgently as it is needed. So I have no concerns about that.
Franz, you grew up yourself on a farm in the countryside of Upper Austria. How did your childhood actually influence your career?
Yeah, it's quite difficult to disentangle, even post hoc, when you look back on your life. Which elements, for instance, of your childhood contributed to the later decisions, like career decisions? But what I would say is that living in the countryside was instrumental for being in close contact to, nature more or less. Yeah. So I think it offered me the opportunity to get in close contact with nature. We played a lot on the small stream nearby. We were a lot out anywhere surrounding the houses, and also was keen to help in the garden with my parents. And of course, it's a pity that nowadays this has become rarer and rarer, even in the countryside. It's rare to see children playing without the supervision of parents.
Still, at the same time, it seems like the generation of young people nowadays is incredibly political and willing to protest and to stand up for environmental rights, for example.
The recognition that the path we are actually on as a society is one that's going into very difficult terrain. This has become commonplace. And the younger you are, the more concerned people tend to be, for obvious reasons. But I would argue that also people of my age, and I'm 50, or even a bit older, will experience much more hardship from the consequences of climate and biodiversity loss than they commonly expect. Of course, it's very difficult to predict which ones, but it's really important to change the trajectory of our society, because otherwise it will be not the future we are envisioning.
We are slowly coming to an end of our conversation, but before I let you go, I would like to invite you to do a short word rap with me, if that's fine for you. So I will give you a few words, a few terms, and you can reply with whatever comes to your mind. It can be one word, one sentence, or even a short story. So the first one is science.
Mysteries, and big fun to address some of the mysteries and sometimes find answers.
Nature.
Yeah, it's quite emotional for me. I really like to be outside.
Upper Austria.
Living now for 30 plus years in Vienna, I still partly feel Upper Austrian, and if I'm asked, I cannot really full-heartedly say I'm Viennese.
I do so as well. Locusts.
Locusts? Yeah, that's an interest of mine. Actually, I'm a botanist, but beyond that, I'm also interested in locusts, so in grasshoppers. And it's really interesting as an ecologist to have expertise in plants and also in one animal group, because you can really see distinct patterns and also complementary patterns, how species are distributed and responding to changes. So, yeah.
Your favorite animal?
Yeah, I would say my cats, our 2 cats we have.
And your message to the world?
It's important to make clear that we are in trouble, but, and that's the second part of the message, it's equally important to understand that every person, every institution, every company can make a difference. If many such small decisions are made, then change can be quite rapid. So I see the potential for change. So being worried does not mean that one has to be frustrated. I would understand this as a matter of motivation for action.
Thank you for that optimistic ending and for the entire conversation. That was really insightful.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. And yeah.
And thank you everybody for listening. Have a look at Franz Essl's research online and subscribe to this podcast, and have a great day.
Greiner Talks, a Greiner podcast. Subscribe now.